The throne room smelled like cedar, cold stone, and the slow-burning rage of a man who had already decided I wasn't enough before I ever opened my mouth. I felt it the second I walked through those doors. Not because someone told me, not because I read it on his face. I felt it the way I feel everything, like a current moving under my skin, electric and unwelcome, threading through the air between us until it settled in my chest like swallowed glass. Alpha King Caden Marlowe was furious. And underneath that fury, buried so deep he probably didn't even know it was there, was shame. My name is River. River Calloway, 23 years old, born Omega, in a pack that treated that word like a warning label, currently standing in the center of the Colorado High Court in a pressed gray shirt and slacks I ironed twice this morning because apparently I iron things when I'm terrified. I hate this room. I've always hated this room. The ceilings are too high. The chandeliers are too bright. And everyone in it is watching me with that specific cocktail of pity and entertainment that powerful people reserve for someone they expect to fall. I gave them a small smile. Let them watch. The bond had made itself known 4 days ago. I'd been at the back of a territorial summit, one of those stiff, over-catered pack meetings where alphas shake hands too hard and omegas stand near the walls, pretending to check their phones. I was legitimately checking my phone. I had 17 unread emails and a group chat called Omega Rights, or Riot, that was absolutely rioting. Then Caden Marlowe walked into the room, and my ability, the thing I'd spent years learning to control, the emotional current I could read and, when necessary, bend, went completely silent. That had never happened before. Usually I feel everyone, a low-level hum of ambient emotion that I've learned to filter, like background noise. Anxiety from the man near the buffet, boredom from the woman by the window, competitive aggression from basically every alpha in a 15-foot radius. But when Caden entered, all of it just stopped. Like the world took a breath and forgot to let it out. He looked at me across that room, not with interest, not with warmth, just looked the way you look at something unexpected sitting in your path. A flicker, a frown. Then he turned away. The bond snapped into place like a rubber band pulled too far. I stood there for a full 30 seconds with my phone in my hand and a half-eaten shrimp cocktail on a napkin, thinking, you have got to be kidding me. The Colorado High Court convened 3 days later. Pack law required formal acknowledgement of a mate bond within 72 hours of recognition. It was one of those old rules nobody bothered to fight because nobody expected to need to. You find your mate, you acknowledge the bond, you begin the official pairing process. Simple, clean, civilized. Except Caden Marlowe hadn't looked at me once during those 72 hours. Hadn't called. Hadn't sent a representative. Hadn't even had the basic decency to send an awkward text. So here we were. Court-mandated acknowledgement. 43 witnesses, 2 pack historians, 1 very tired-looking court official named Gerald who I genuinely felt sorry for, and me, standing 12 feet from the Alpha King of the Colorado Territory, feeling the absolute wall of cold disdain radiating off him like a second presence in the room. I reached out with my ability, just a light touch, the emotional equivalent of reading the room, and what I found made my stomach drop. Disgust. Not at me specifically, at the situation, at the bond itself, at whatever version of fate had decided that his mate was a low-ranked Omega from a mid-tier pack with no territory, no bloodline distinction, and I'm quoting the look on his beta advisor's face, no obvious strategic value. Underneath the disgust was something else, something quieter and a lot more complicated. I pulled back before I could identify it. Some things you don't want to know. Caden spoke first. His voice was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd spent his entire life being obeyed. Low, controlled. The kind of voice that didn't raise itself because it had never needed to. I acknowledge the presence of a bond, he said, addressing the court historian and not me. I do not acknowledge it as valid. I am exercising my right as Alpha King to formally reject the pairing. The room went very quiet. Gerald, the court official, looked deeply uncomfortable. I counted to 3 in my head. Then I felt it, the shift in the room's emotional atmosphere. Pity from the left side of the chamber. Smug satisfaction from a cluster of higher-ranked Omegas near the back, who had apparently come hoping for exactly this. Shock from a few of the younger pack members who still believed, bless them, that Alpha Kings had manners. And from Kayden himself, the moment the words left his mouth, something fast and sharp that tasted like regret. Not enough to stop him. But it was there. I let the silence stretch one beat longer than was comfortable. Then I smiled. Not the nervous kind. Not the wounded kind. The kind that makes people wonder what you know that they don't. Okay, I said. Kayden blinked. Just once. But I caught it. Okay? Gerald repeated, like the word had arrived in a language he didn't speak. Okay. I smoothed the front of my shirt and addressed the court historian directly, because if Kayden wasn't going to look at me, I wasn't going to perform for him. He's exercised his right to reject the bond. I'd like to exercise mine. The historian's pen stopped moving. Under Colorado Pack Code, Section 1-4, Clause 3, I continued, because I had spent 2 days reading pack law, and I was going to get every cent of value out of that miserable experience. A rejected Omega retains the right to formally dissolve the bond on record, releasing all future claims, territorial obligations, and mate bond protections from both parties. I let that last part land. Both parties, meaning him too, meaning the Alpha King of Colorado, effective immediately, held zero legal claim over me. The smug cluster at the back of the room had gone very still. Kayden's jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough. Consider the bond dissolved, I said pleasantly. Gerald, I'll need that in writing. I walked out of the Colorado High Court at 11:14 on a Tuesday morning, with my dissolved bond paperwork tucked under my arm, a coffee from the vending machine in the lobby that tasted like warm regret, and the very distinct, emotional signature of 43 people watching me leave. 39 of them were stunned. 3 were furious. One, just one, standing at the front of the room with his hands clasped behind his back and his expression carved from something harder than stone, was feeling something I hadn't expected. Something I didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt dangerously close to want. I didn't look back. That want, raw and barely leashed, pressing against the back of my awareness like a hand flat against a closed door. I didn't turn around. I kept my footsteps even, my coffee cup steady, my face arranged into the specific expression I'd perfected over years of being underestimated. Calm, unbothered, faintly amused, like the world was doing something mildly interesting that I hadn't quite decided to care about yet. Inside, my ability was rioting. Here's the thing nobody tells you about emotion manipulation. Everyone hears the word manipulation and assumes it's all power and control. Like I'm sitting somewhere twirling a villain cape and bending people to my will. And yes, technically, I can do that. I've done it exactly twice in my life, both times under circumstances I'm not ready to talk about, and both times it left me feeling like I'd swallowed something that didn't belong to me. Most of the time, what the ability actually does is make me a human emotional antenna. I feel everything, everyone, all the time. The low hum of a stranger's grief in a grocery store line. The sour spike of jealousy from a coworker across an office. The specific flavor of exhaustion that lives in people who've been strong for too long. It's a lot. It's always a lot. And right now, with 43 people's emotional residue still buzzing under my skin and Kayden Marlowe's unidentified want pressing at the edges of my perception, I needed air, and I needed it immediately. I pushed through the side exit and stepped out into the November cold. Denver, in November, had exactly one personality, and that personality was sharp. The air hit me like a reset button, cold and clean, cutting through the emotional static until I could finally hear myself think. I exhaled, watched the breath dissolve into the gray morning, took a sip of vending machine coffee, and made a face because it genuinely tasted like someone had described coffee to a machine that had never met coffee personally. Okay. Fine. I was okay. The bond was dissolved. Officially. On record. I had paperwork. Gerald had looked vaguely traumatized while stamping it, but he had stamped it. And in the world of pack law, Gerald's stamp was gospel. Kayden Marlowe had no claim on me. I had no claim on him. We were two strangers who had briefly and inconveniently been cosmically assigned to each other and had since sorted it out like adults. Well, like one adult and one alpha king who'd stared at me like I'd personally offended his entire bloodline, but the outcome was the same. I was free. This was fine. I was fine. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen, said a voice behind me, or the dumbest. I genuinely can't decide. I turned around. Leaning against the building's exterior wall with his arms crossed and an expression of pure, delighted disbelief was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark green jacket that probably cost more than my rent, with warm brown skin and eyes that were doing something genuinely unfair in the morning light. Alpha. Definitely alpha. I could feel the self-assurance coming off him in easy, unhurried waves. Nothing aggressive. Just the settled confidence of someone who'd never once had to prove he belonged in a room. He was also, unfortunately, extremely good-looking, which I noted the way you note a potential hazard, clinically, professionally, with absolutely zero personal interest. Both, I said. It was both. They're not mutually exclusive. His mouth curved. You just dissolved a mate bond with the Alpha King of Colorado in front of his entire court. I did. And then you told Gerald you'd need it in writing. Gerald was very helpful. Gerald looked like he was having a medical event. Gerald will recover, I said. He seemed resilient. The man laughed. Actually laughed. Not the polished social version, but a real one, surprised out of him. And the emotional signature that came with it was so genuinely warm that my ability registered it before I could tell it not to. No performance. No angle. Just actual amusement. I was involuntarily charmed. I resented it immediately. Declan Ashford, he said, pushing off the wall and extending a hand. I looked at the hand. Here's the other thing about psychometry-adjacent abilities. I don't read objects the way some Omegas do. My power runs on living emotion, not memory residue. But skin contact with a strong emotional source? That turned up the volume considerably. Shaking a stranger Alpha's hand outside a court building, where I had just done something extremely inadvisable, was not on my list of recommended activities for the day. I shook it anyway because I was curious, and curiosity has always been my most consistent character flaw. Warmth. Steadiness. Something underneath that felt like recognition, which was strange, because we had never met. And right at the surface, clear as anything, genuine respect. Not for my bloodline, not for my pack rank, for what I'd just done in that room. I let go before I could read anything deeper. River Calloway, I said. I know. He said it simply. No smugness attached. You're not easy to miss, River Calloway. Especially not today. I'm going to assume that's a compliment. And move on. It is. He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an attention that wasn't invasive, just focused. I'm the Alpha of the Ashford Pack, Eastern Territory, based out of Hartford, Connecticut. I was here for the summit extension meetings. He paused. I also watched the entire proceeding from the observer's gallery. I processed that. The gallery has tinted glass. It does. So you watched without me knowing, along with 11 other pack representatives. He didn't sound apologetic about it, just honest. Pack law acknowledgement proceedings are public record. Anyone can observe. That was technically true. I'd just forgotten anyone might actually bother. What did you think? I asked, because I genuinely wanted to know, and also because I was testing the emotional response, that split-second gap between question and answer, where people feel before they perform. What I got from Declan Ashford in that gap was simple and surprisingly unguarded. Impressed. And something quieter behind it. Something that felt like the beginning of interest. Not the shallow kind. The kind that wanted something from me, but the kind that leaned forward. I think, he said carefully, that you walked into a room where everyone expected you to fall apart, and you didn't even give them the satisfaction of looking shaken. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out a card. Clean white. Embossed. The kind of card that didn't need to try hard because it already knew what it was. My pack is hosting a formal territorial gathering in Hartford next month. As a diplomatic guest, no obligations attached. He held it steady, not pushing it toward me, just offering. "I'd like you to come." I looked at the card. I looked at him. I felt the hallway behind me, and somewhere deep in the building, past the tinted glass and the marble floors, and Gerald's rapidly cooling tea, I felt a familiar wall of cold control suddenly spike with something hot and directionless and absolutely furious. Caden Marlowe could feel it too. The distance between an Alpha King and his dissolved bond was apparently not quite far enough to stop the connection from whispering. I took Declan's card. "I'll think about it," I said, and I smiled, slow and deliberate, facing away from the building entirely. The card was heavier than it looked. Not literally. It was cardstock. Good cardstock. The kind with a slight texture that costs extra and signals that the person handing it to you has never once had to check their bank account before a purchase. But emotionally, the thing practically hummed in my fingers. Declan Ashford's energy was still warm on it. Steady. Unhurried. I tucked it into my shirt pocket and told myself I was thinking about it practically. Hartford was a good territory. Ashford Pack had a clean reputation. A diplomatic guest invitation was professionally interesting and personally meaningless, and absolutely not related to the fact that the man had warm eyes and had laughed like someone who didn't rehearse it. I was being practical. Very practical. Extremely practical. The side door behind me opened. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The emotional signature hit me before the footsteps did, cold and controlled on the surface and underneath it, moving fast and hot like lava under ice, something I still didn't have a clean word for. Caden Marlowe had followed me outside. I took a sip of my terrible coffee. "Mr. Calloway." His voice did the same thing it had done in the courtroom, landed without effort, took up space without asking, the kind of voice that had been obeyed so consistently it had forgotten how to request. "Your Majesty," I said pleasantly, still not turning around. "How's Gerald doing? Emotionally, I mean." A pause. Short, but textured. The kind that meant he had prepared something to say, and my response had briefly derailed it. Good. Derailment was one of my better skills. "I'd like a word," Caden said. "You've already had several." I finally turned around, because I wasn't going to have a conversation with his reflection in a parked car window like some kind of emotional coward. In front of 43 witnesses. Very clearly spoken words. Excellent diction, actually. I was impressed. He looked different up close. I'd seen him at the summit, across a crowded room, a general impression of height and authority, and a jawline that had probably inspired at least one architectural decision somewhere. Up close, he was more specific than that. Dark hair, slightly disheveled at the edges like he'd run a hand through it recently. Gray eyes that were doing something complicated. A jaw so tight I could feel the tension from 3 feet away without even reaching for it. He was also, against my will and better judgment, extremely compelling in the specific way that dangerous things sometimes are. The way a storm looks beautiful before it breaks. I kept my face neutral and my ability on light monitoring mode because whatever Caden Marlowe was feeling right now was coming in loud, and I needed to not let it show on my face that I could hear every word of it. "The dissolution stands," I said, before he could open with whatever he'd planned. "I'm not here to renegotiate. If the court needs anything else from me, Gerald has my email. I'm not here about the dissolution." That was unexpected. I felt the truth of it immediately. No deception in the words, just a kind of stripped-down directness that didn't match the image he'd projected in that courtroom. I studied him. He was studying me back. "Then what are you here about?" I asked. Caden's jaw shifted. Something moved through his expression that he clearly wasn't used to wearing in public. Something uncertain, and the emotional undercurrent that came with it hit me so fast I almost took a step back. Not want this time. Panic. Low-grade, tightly leashed, buried under 3 layers of alpha composure. But absolutely panic. The kind that lives in people who have just realized they've made an irreversible decision, and the consequences have only just become real. I had felt this exact emotion before. On myself. Twice. Once when I was 19, and had accidentally amplified a roomful of grieving people's sadness so intensely that I'd spent the next 6 hours crying in a bathroom stall, feeling things that weren't mine. And once last Tuesday, when a cosmic bond had decided to attach itself to me without my consent, I acted within my rights, Caden said. The words were measured, careful, like he was placing them down one at a time and checking each one before committing. The rejection was lawful. It was, I agreed. And so was my dissolution. We're very law-abiding people, you and I. It's a nice thing to have in common. Something flickered in his eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite irritation. Something that lived in the narrow space between them. You didn't have to dissolve it publicly. I tilted my head. You rejected me publicly. That's different. Is it? I asked, genuinely curious. Not performing curiosity. Actually wondering what logic lived inside that sentence. Walk me through the difference. I'm interested. He opened his mouth, closed it. I felt the moment he realized he didn't have an answer, that held up. The panic sharpened briefly. Then he pulled it back, smoothed it over, rebuilt the wall with the efficiency of someone who had been doing that particular emotional construction job his entire life. It was honestly impressive. Most people couldn't reassemble composure that fast. Most people also didn't have a lifetime of practice hiding from themselves. Declan Ashford, Caden said. The name landed differently than the other words. Flatter. Harder. Ah, there it was. He introduced himself, I said. We had a nice conversation. He gave me his card. Riveting stuff. He's dangerous. I stared at him. I let the stare sit for a full 3 seconds, which, in conversation terms, is approximately 1 geological era. I'm sorry, I said slowly. You rejected me in front of your entire court 40 minutes ago, and now you're warning me about dangerous men. Caden's expression didn't change, but his emotional signature did. Something raw moved through it, fast and gone, like a fish breaking the surface of dark water. I have reasons, he said quietly. I'm sure you do. I finished the last of my terrible coffee and dropped the cup in the recycling bin beside the door because I was stressed and petty in equal measure. Everybody has reasons, Your Majesty. Reasons are very popular. They don't actually change what happened. I started walking. Not running. Not fleeing. Walking at a pace that communicated I had somewhere to be that was more interesting than this conversation, which was not technically true but was emotionally necessary. River. My name in his mouth stopped me. Not because he commanded it. He didn't use alpha authority, didn't push any dominance into it, which meant the word landed on its own weight. Just my name, plain and slightly rough at the edges, like it had cost him something small to say it without armor around it. I stopped walking. I didn't turn around. The reasons, he said, and I could feel him choosing words with the care of someone navigating something that mattered more than he wanted it to. They weren't about you. I know, I said quietly. That surprised him. I felt it. Then why? Because knowing the reasons doesn't mean I have to accept the outcome. I started walking again. Have a good afternoon, Your Majesty. This time he didn't call after me, but I felt him standing there, watching me leave, and the emotional signature he was wearing as I turned the corner was something I was going to be thinking about for the rest of the day, whether I wanted to or not. It felt like a man standing at the edge of something he'd already jumped off of, realizing, too late, that he wanted to go back. I turned the corner and immediately walked into a pillar. Not metaphorically. An actual structural pillar. One of the decorative stone ones lining the court building's main entrance colonnade. Cold and completely immovable. And entirely my fault for walking, with my ability stretched backward, like an emotional periscope, instead of watching where I was going. I stepped back, straightened my shirt, looked around to confirm no witnesses, and kept walking. Nobody saw that. It didn't happen. The main lobby of the Colorado High Court building was one of those aggressively impressive spaces designed to make you feel the full weight of institutional authority before you even reached the information desk. High ceilings, marble floors the color of old money, a seal embedded in the floor tile that people were technically not supposed to walk on, but everyone did anyway because the alternative was walking around the entire perimeter of the lobby like some kind of pack law fanatic. I walked directly across it. The lobby was still carrying emotional residue from the morning's proceedings. I could feel it the way you feel the warmth left behind in a chair someone recently vacated, tension that hadn't fully dissolved. Curiosity. The particular social electricity of people who had witnessed something unexpected and were still processing whether they were allowed to talk about it. Several of those people were still in the lobby. I felt the moment they noticed me. It moved through the room like a small wave. Recognition, followed immediately by that complicated social calculation people do when they're deciding how to interact with someone who has just done something publicly unprecedented. Were they supposed to pretend they hadn't seen? Acknowledge it? Come over and say something? A woman near the information desk made eye contact and then immediately looked at her phone with the energy of someone who had decided that was the safer option. A younger man, maybe 20 or so, wearing a PAC intern lanyard and an expression of undisguised awe, opened his mouth like he was going to say something. I gave him a small nod. He looked like he might pass out. I kept moving. The exit was 40 feet away, and I was going to reach it with my dignity intact if it was the last thing I did today, which, given the trajectory of my morning, was not an unreasonable concern. River Calloway. The voice came from my left, not Caden. Different energy entirely. This one carried the self-important warmth of someone who considered themselves a public figure and expected to be received as such. I turned. The man walking toward me was maybe 45, silver-haired, wearing the kind of fitted charcoal suit that suggested he had opinions about thread count. His emotional signature reached me before he did. Confident, calculating, wrapped in a surface layer of practiced friendliness that was doing a genuinely competent job of concealing something considerably less friendly underneath. I did not like him immediately, which was notable because I usually gave people at least 30 seconds before forming strong opinions. Senator Harlan Price, he said, extending a hand. PAC Liaison Committee. I was in the observer gallery this morning. Another gallery watcher. Apparently, the tinted glass situation had been very popular today. I shook his hand because refusing to shake a senator's hand in a government building had a specific set of consequences I wasn't prepared to manage. The contact lasted 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough. Calculation, ambition, and something pointed underneath both of those, not quite directed at me personally, but adjacent to me, like I was a variable in an equation he was already running. I let go. Senator, I said. Polite. Measured. Busy morning for the gallery. Extraordinary morning, he said, with the smile of a man who deployed smiles professionally. What you did in that courtroom was remarkable. Genuinely. I don't think anyone expected it. That seemed to be the general consensus. The dissolution clause is rarely invoked. He fell into step beside me, which I hadn't invited, but also hadn't technically prevented, moving toward the exit, like we were simply two people heading the same direction. Most Omegas in your position would have accepted the rejection and moved on quietly. Most Omegas in my position weren't me, I said. He laughed. It was smooth and practiced, and the emotional content behind it was mild appreciation for the answer, and absolutely nothing warmer than that. No, he agreed. They certainly weren't. A brief pause, perfectly timed. You're with the Calloway PAC, mid-tier territory, Eastern Denver corridor. He said it as a statement. He already knew the answer. This was the kind of man who didn't ask questions he hadn't already researched. That's right, I said. No formal political affiliations. No inter-PAC alliances on record. Another pause. And yet you knew Section 14, Clause 3, well enough to cite it from memory, in front of the court historian. I read, I said simply. The exit doors were 20 feet away. 15. I'd like to have a conversation with you, Senator Price said. Not today. When things have settled. There are people who would be very interested in meeting you, River. People who believe the current alpha hierarchy in Colorado has been unchallenged for too long. I stopped walking. He stopped too, half a step later, turning to face me with that professional smile still in place. I looked at him for a moment. Then I reached out with my ability, not the light monitoring touch I used by default, but a real look, deliberate, focused. What I found was layered and not entirely comfortable to sit inside. The ambition was genuine. So was the resentment toward Caden's seat of power. But what lived underneath those things was something more complex. A belief, actually sincerely held, that the current structure was damaging Omegas in this territory, that someone needed to push back against it. He wasn't wrong about that part. He was also absolutely intending to use me as the instrument of that push, which was a different thing entirely from caring about what happened to me afterward. I pulled back. I appreciate the interest, Senator, I said carefully. I'm going to need some time to think. Of course. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a card, slightly thicker than Declan's, with a state seal embossed in the corner. Take all the time you need. I took the card. I now had 2 cards in my possession and had been outside for approximately 25 minutes. This morning was genuinely something else. I pushed through the exit doors, and the November air hit me again. Colder now, the sky having committed fully to gray while I was inside collecting business cards from powerful men with complicated agendas. I stood on the front steps of the Colorado High Court, bond dissolution paperwork under one arm, 2 cards in my shirt pocket, terrible coffee, long gone, and I looked out at the parking lot and the street beyond it, and the very ordinary Tuesday morning continuing without any awareness of what had just happened inside that building. My phone buzzed. A text from my best friend Marcus, who had been waiting for an update since 7 this morning. It read, River Calloway, if you do not tell me what happened in the next 30 seconds, I will drive to Denver and make a scene. Then 3 seconds later, I will make such a scene. Then, a governmental scene. I sat down on the steps, dropped my paperwork beside me, and started typing. It was going to be a long text. I typed for a solid 90 seconds, which in text message terms is essentially writing a dissertation. I gave Marcus the broad strokes, the courtroom, the dissolution, Declan and his card, Senator Price and his card, the pillar. I left out the pillar actually. Some things were between me and the architecture. His response came in 4 separate messages, sent so fast they arrived almost simultaneously. What? River, you dissolved the bond with the Alpha King of Colorado. I am calling you right now. My phone rang before I finished reading the last one. I picked up, before you say anything, I started. You cited Section 14, Clause 3, Marcus said, at a volume that suggested he was either very excited or standing in a wind tunnel. In front of the court historian, River, that law has not been invoked in 11 years. I'm aware. How are you this calm? Why do you sound like you ordered a sandwich? You dissolved a royal mate bond and collected 2 business cards before noon on a Tuesday. When you say it like that, it sounds excessive. It is excessive. It's magnificently, spectacularly excessive. There was a sound of movement on his end, like he was pacing. Marcus always paced when he was processing large amounts of information. Okay. Walk me through Declan Ashford. What did your ability say? This was the thing about Marcus. We had been best friends since junior year of college, when he had sat next to me in a behavioral psychology seminar and immediately noticed that I was reading the professor's emotional state instead of taking notes. He was a beta, perceptive in the way that certain betas were, the ones who paid attention to people as a lifestyle choice rather than a skill set. He was also the only person outside my immediate family who knew about my ability in any meaningful detail, and he treated that information with the kind of careful respect that had cemented my trust in him permanently. Warm, I said. Genuine. The interest felt real, not transactional. But, I didn't say but. River, I've known you for 6 years. There's always a but. I looked out at the parking lot. A group of PAC officials were emerging from the building's main entrance, talking among themselves, one of them glancing toward me before quickly looking away. The news was already moving. I could feel it at the edges, that specific social electricity of information spreading through a network. The interest felt real, I said again. But interest isn't the same as safe. And I've been wrong before. Marcus was quiet for exactly 1 second, which meant he was filing that information carefully rather than responding to it immediately. That was one of his best qualities. He knew when something I said was about the present and when it was about something older. "What about Caden?" he asked. Careful, deliberate. I leaned back on the steps and tilted my face up toward the gray November sky. "He followed me outside," I said. The silence on Marcus's end was extremely loud. "He what?" "He followed me outside. Wanted to talk. Said the rejection wasn't about me." I paused. "He also warned me about Declan Ashford. The man he has zero legal claim over you warned you about the man who gave you a nice card and genuine warmth." "That's an accurate summary, yes." "River." Marcus's voice shifted into the specific register he used when he was about to say something I wasn't going to enjoy hearing. "What did your ability feel from Caden?" "Not what he said." "What did you feel?" I was quiet. The wind moved across the steps, cold and direct, lifting the edge of my paperwork. I pressed my hand down on it. "Something I don't have a name for yet," I said honestly. "That's not nothing," Marcus said quietly. "That's actually the opposite of nothing." "I know. Are you okay?" I dissolved a mate bond this morning and then had 2 separate powerful men try to recruit me for their respective agendas within 20 minutes of each other. I considered the question seriously. I think I'm operating on adrenaline and bad vending machine coffee, and I'm probably going to crash around 3 o'clock. "Come to mine," Marcus said immediately. "I'll make actual coffee. You can debrief properly, and I'll tell you everything I know about Declan Ashford's pack because I did a research paper on Eastern Territory Alliance's junior year, and I remember things." "You remember a research paper from 6 years ago?" "I remember everything. It's my burden and my gift. Come over." I was already reaching for my paperwork, stacking it against my knee. "Give me 40 minutes. I'll put the coffee on now." I hung up and stood, tucking the dissolution papers more securely under my arm, and that was when the door behind me opened, and I felt it before I heard it. A signature, so familiar now, it had already started developing its own texture in my awareness. Caden had come outside again. I didn't turn around this time either, but for a different reason than before. Before, it was strategy. Now, it was because my ability had just picked up something from him that I genuinely needed a moment to process before I could arrange my face into anything resembling neutrality. He was on his phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be clear about that. I was 2 steps away from walking down to the parking lot, and I was absolutely minding my own business. But my ability didn't require trying. It just received. And what it received from Caden Marlowe in that moment was so unguarded, it almost didn't feel like him at all. Fear. Not the panic from before. The controlled, leashed variety. This was older than that. Deeper. The kind of fear that had been living in someone for a long time, long enough to become structural. Part of how they moved through the world without anyone on the outside being able to see it. And underneath the fear, wrapped around it like a secondary layer, something that made my chest do something complicated and unwelcome. Grief. I turned around before I could stop myself. Caden stood at the top of the steps, phone pressed to his ear, eyes on the middle distance. He wasn't looking at me. His expression was doing the controlled, carved stone thing it did in public, but his free hand, hanging at his side, was pressed flat against his thigh, with the rigid stillness of someone physically holding themselves together. He said something into the phone, too quiet for me to catch the words. Then he listened. And what moved through his emotional field in response to whatever he heard was so sudden and so raw that I actually felt it land in my own chest, like second-hand impact. Not want, not panic, recognition. The devastating kind. The kind that came from hearing something you had always known but had been successfully avoiding for long enough that hearing it out loud felt like the first time. He lowered the phone. His eyes found mine. For the first time since this entire morning had begun, Caden Marlowe looked at me without any of the architecture he usually kept between himself and the world. Just for a second. Then it was gone. "Mr. Calloway?" he said. His voice was completely steady. His hand was still flat against his thigh. "Your Majesty," I said. We looked at each other across 6 feet of cold November air. "Drive safe," he said quietly. I held his gaze for one breath longer than I should have. Then I walked down the steps toward the parking lot, and I did not look back, and my ability carried his grief with me all the way to my car, like something I had picked up without meaning to, and didn't yet know how to put down. I sat in my car for 4 minutes before starting the engine. Not because I was emotional. I was completely fine. I was a dissolved, unbonded, fully autonomous Omega, who had handled his morning with remarkable composure, and was now sitting in a parking lot, staring at a pine tree air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror, and definitely not thinking about the look on Caden Marlowe's face when whatever he heard on that phone call hit him somewhere unguarded. The grief had been real. I knew real from performed. I had been reading emotional signatures my entire life, since I was 7 years old, and accidentally amplified my mother's homesickness so intensely at a family dinner that she cried into her mashed potatoes for 6 minutes while everyone panicked. Real grief had a specific texture. Dense. Layered. The kind that had been carried long enough to develop weight. Caden Marlowe was carrying something very heavy. That was not my problem. I started the engine. Marcus lived 22 minutes from the court building on a normal traffic day, which in Denver terms meant 35 minutes on a Tuesday morning when everyone had apparently decided to use the same 3 roads simultaneously. I took the longer route through Capitol Hill, partly because the traffic was better and partly because driving with something to look at helped my ability settle when it was overstimulated. Tall old houses, coffee shops with sandwich boards out front, a dog being walked by a man who was clearly being walked by the dog. Normal Tuesday. Normal world. Completely unbothered by the fact that I had restructured my entire legal standing in the Colorado PAC hierarchy before 11 in the morning. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Unknown number. I let it ring. Unknown numbers on a day like today had a very high probability of being someone who had been in that observer gallery and had gotten my contact information through channels I didn't want to think about. It stopped. Then it buzzed again. Text this time. I caught a red light and glanced at it. "This is Declan Ashford. I got your number from the public PAC registry. I want to be transparent about that, rather than pretend it appeared by magic. I hope that's all right." Then, 30 seconds later, "I also want to say, separate from the invitation, that what you did this morning took real courage. That's all. No agenda attached to that part." I stared at the message for the full duration of the red light. The light turned green. I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and drove. Here was the thing about Declan Ashford. My ability had felt genuine warmth from him. Real respect. The absence of immediate calculation that usually layered itself over interactions with high-ranking alphas who wanted something, and his text had just demonstrated a specific kind of emotional intelligence that I found genuinely difficult to dismiss. The choice to be transparent about how he got my number before I could wonder about it. That was a person who understood how trust worked. It was also, I was aware, exactly the kind of thing a very skilled person would do if they wanted to appear trustworthy. I had been wrong before. Not often. My ability made certain categories of deception very difficult to miss. But emotion and intention were not the same thing. A person could feel genuine warmth toward you and still be moving you like a piece on a board they hadn't shown you yet. Senator Price had felt genuine conviction underneath his calculation. Declan had felt genuine interest underneath his composure. Caden had felt genuine grief underneath his control. Genuine didn't mean safe. Genuine didn't mean good. Genuine just meant real. And real people with real feelings caused real damage when the situation called for it. I pulled onto Marcus's street. His house was a narrow 2-story in Capitol Hill, with a bright blue door that he had chosen specifically because the Homeowners Association had initially said it was too bold, which had immediately guaranteed his commitment to it. There was a plant on the front porch that had been dying slowly and persistently for 3 years, and Marcus watered it faithfully anyway, on the grounds that consistency mattered, even when outcomes were uncertain. I had always thought that Plant said something important about him. I parked, grabbed my paperwork, and was halfway up the front walk when the blue door opened and Marcus appeared, holding 2 mugs and wearing an expression that was equal parts concern and barely contained excitement. Marcus Bennett was 30 years old, beta, built like someone who had played college basketball and then discovered he preferred cooking, with warm, dark skin and eyes that noticed everything, and a smile that arrived slowly and meant it when it got there. He was the most emotionally intelligent person I had ever met who wasn't actively reading emotional signatures to do it. He just paid attention in the way that most people couldn't be bothered to. "You look surprisingly okay," he said, handing me a mug. "I am surprisingly okay. Your left eye does the thing when you're not actually okay." I took a sip of coffee. Real coffee. Properly made. The kind that tasted like a functional morning, rather than a vending machine's best guess. "What thing?" "It goes still. Like the rest of your face is performing fine, and your left eye didn't get the memo." He held the door open. "Come in. Sit. Talk." I sat at his kitchen table, which was covered in the comfortable clutter of someone who lived actively in their space. Books stacked beside a fruit bowl. A half-finished crossword. 3 different kinds of hot sauce lined up near the stove with the seriousness of a collection. Marcus sat across from me, wrapped both hands around his mug, and looked at me with the specific quality of attention that had made me trust him 6 years ago and hadn't stopped since. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Not the legal part, the felt part." So I did. I told him about the bond recognition at the summit 4 days ago, the silence that had fallen over my ability when Caden walked in, that total uncharacteristic blankness that had never happened before or since, the way it had snapped back into place with the bond attached, uninvited and immediate. I told him about the courtroom, about feeling Caden's disgust at the situation and the shame underneath it, and that faster buried thing I hadn't been able to identify in the moment. I told him about the hallway, about Declan, about what I'd felt when I shook his hand. I told him about Senator Price and the layered calculation wrapped around genuine conviction. And then I told him about the steps, about Caden on the phone, about the grief, old and structural, and the recognition that had moved through him when he heard whatever he heard, and the look on his face afterward, unguarded for exactly 1 second before the walls came back up. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting, which was one of his finest qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his mug slowly between his palms. "The silence when you first recognized the bond," he said finally. "Your ability going quiet. Has that ever happened with anyone else?" "No," I said. "Never. Not dampened. Not muffled. Silent. Completely." He nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he had been turning over while I talked. "River," he said carefully, "I need to tell you something I probably should have told you 4 days ago when you first called me about the bond recognition. And I didn't because I wasn't sure, and I didn't want to make it harder." He met my eyes. "I know why Caden Marlowe rejected the bond." The kitchen went very quiet. Not the comfortable kind. "Talk," I said. Marcus set down his mug. "His younger brother Everett," he said. "He died 14 months ago. Complications from a forced bond. A mating that Everett didn't choose, that the family approved for political reasons, that went wrong in ways that PAC law still doesn't have adequate language for." He paused. "Caden was the one who found him." The coffee in my hands was warm and I was not feeling it. "After Everett," Marcus continued quietly, "Caden made a public statement that he would never enforce a bond on another Omega. Not politically, not personally, not for any reason." He looked at me steadily. "The rejection this morning wasn't about you, River. It was the one promise he believed he could keep for his brother. The grief, old and structural, the kind carried long enough to develop weight. I understood it now. That didn't make it hurt less. It made it hurt differently, which was in some ways considerably worse." I sat with that for a moment, my hands around Marcus's good coffee, the dissolution paperwork on the table between us, and outside the window, Denver's Tuesday morning continuing forward without any awareness that something inside me had just quietly, completely shifted. He should have told me. I said finally. My voice came out even. Steady. Yes, Marcus agreed. He should have. That changes the context. It doesn't change what happened. No, Marcus said. It doesn't. I looked down at the paperwork. The dissolution was real. The stamp was real. Whatever Caden's reasons were, the outcome lived on record now, and I had put it there, with my own words, in front of 43 witnesses. But the look on his face on those steps, the grief, the 1 second of no walls. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the paperwork and felt nothing from it. Just paper. Just ink. Some things didn't leave emotional residue because they weren't finished yet. I sat with that thought longer than was probably healthy. Marcus let me. That was the thing about him. He understood the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed space, and he had never once tried to rush me through the second kind. He just refilled my coffee without asking, and went back to his mug and let the kitchen be quiet in the way that only felt safe in certain houses with certain people. I was grateful for it. I was also, underneath the gratitude, doing the thing my ability sometimes forced me to do when information arrived that restructured something I thought I understood, processing it in layers. Caden's grief first, then the context of Everett. Then the geometry of the morning rearranging itself around this new information like furniture shifted in a room I thought I had memorized. The rejection wasn't contempt. It was grief, wearing the only armor it knew how to put on in public. That didn't excuse it. I had been clear with myself about that before I left Marcus's kitchen table, and I stayed clear about it now. Understanding why someone hurts you is not the same as deciding it was acceptable. Caden Marlowe had made a choice that morning. A choice shaped by genuine pain, yes, but a choice. He had looked at a living person standing in front of him and decided that his private promise to his dead brother mattered more than treating that person with the basic dignity of an explanation. I deserved an explanation. I still did. Understanding the reason didn't dissolve that. I pulled out my phone and looked at Declan's text again. No agenda attached to that part. I typed back, "Thank you. I appreciate the transparency about the registry." I stopped, deleted the last sentence, started again. "Thank you. Transparency is underrated." Sent it before I could edit it into something more guarded. Marcus was watching me from across the table with a specific expression he wore when he was actively choosing not to say something. "Say it," I said. "I didn't say anything. Your face said something." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I just think it's interesting that you responded to Declan within 4 minutes of learning about Everett Marlowe." I looked at him. "I'm not doing anything," I said. "I sent 3 words. You sent 7 words very quickly after receiving information that complicated your feelings about a different alpha." "Marcus, I'm just noting the timing. Purely observational. You're the most annoying person I trust," I told him sincerely. He smiled into his coffee. "I know." My phone buzzed. Declan again. "It really is. Most people perform transparency rather than practice it. There's a difference. Then, I hope today gets quieter for you. You've earned a boring afternoon." Something about the second message, its complete absence of agenda, the way it asked nothing and expected nothing, settled into my chest with a warmth I hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. I set the phone down. "Okay," Marcus said, shifting forward in his chair with the energy of someone who had been patient long enough and had information to deliver. "Let me tell you what I know about Declan Ashford, because the research paper was 6 years ago, but I have a good memory, and this feels relevant. Go." Ashford PAC has one of the cleanest records in the Eastern Territories. No forced bond violations on record. Omega welfare ratings consistently high. Declan took over from his father 8 years ago at 24, which is young for an alpha succession, and the circumstances around that succession were, he paused, complicated. I felt the shape of what was coming before the words arrived. "How complicated?" I said. "His father was removed," Marcus said carefully, "internally, by the PAC's own senior members. There were allegations of bond coercion, multiple Omegas. Nothing that ever made it to formal PAC court because the victims were afraid and the process was slow, and Declan's father had a lot of political cover. he met my eyes. Declan was the one who brought it to the senior members. His own father. He was 23. The warmth I had felt from Declan's hand, the steadiness, the respect that wasn't about bloodline or rank. I was beginning to understand where it came from. "He's not innocent," Marcus said. "Nobody in that kind of position is entirely innocent. But he made a hard choice young, and it shaped him." A pause. "He also has no current mate bond, no formal pairings on record, which for an alpha of his rank at 32 is unusual enough to be notable." "Why?" "Nobody knows. He's never explained it publicly." Marcus looked at me steadily. "But I think it's interesting that the first person he gives his card to, outside a mate bond dissolution proceeding, is an Omega who just demonstrated in front of a full court that he makes his own decisions." I sat with that. Then my phone rang. Not a text. An actual call. The unknown number from earlier. I looked at it. Looked at Marcus. He raised his eyebrows. I picked up. "Mr. Calloway." The voice was not one I recognized. Male. Older. Careful in the way that lawyers and archivists were careful. Like every word was being placed on a scale before release. "My name is Theodore Vance. I'm the senior records keeper for Colorado Pack Court. I apologize for the intrusion." "How did you get this number?" I asked. Because apparently today had a theme. "Senator Price's office provided it. With your documented consent form on file from this morning's proceeding." I made a mental note to read consent forms more carefully at 7 in the morning when I was running on anxiety and no breakfast. "What can I do for you, Mr. Vance?" I said. "It's more a matter of what the record can do for you," he said. "Or rather, what it already has done, which I'm legally obligated to inform you of within 6 hours of the proceeding." A brief pause, the kind that meant what came next was going to be significant. When a mate bond dissolution is filed under Section 14, Clause 3 inches, the Colorado Territory, there is a secondary provision that activates automatically. It's in the original code. Most people are unaware of it because the clause has only been invoked 3 times in the territory's documented history. Marcus had gone very still across the table. My ability, running its standard ambient scan, picked up nothing from the phone because Theodore Vance was not in the room. But my own chest had started doing something slow and alert. "What provision?" I said. "The dissolution of a royal mate bond," Theodore Vance said, with the careful tone of someone reading from a document they wanted to get exactly right. "When filed by the Omega Party against an alpha of standing, automatically confers upon the Omega Party a formal position within the Colorado Territory's protected class. This includes residential rights, pack resource access, and," another pause, "a standing invitation to the Colorado Alpha Court as an independent voice, non-voting, but present and protected." The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator. "I'm sorry," I said. "Can you say that last part again?" "You have a seat at the Alpha King's Court, Mr. Calloway. Not because he gave it to you." Theodore Vance's voice carried something underneath the professional, careful tone. Something that sounded, faintly, like satisfaction. "Because the law gave it to you, and he cannot remove it." I put the phone face down on Marcus's kitchen table. I stared at the crossword puzzle beside the fruit bowl. Marcus stared at me. "River," he said slowly. "What just happened?" I picked the phone back up. "Mr. Vance, are you saying that Caden Marlowe, who rejected me this morning to protect himself from the pain of a bond, has now, by the operation of his own territory's law, given me a permanent, protected, irremovable presence in his court?" "That is correct," Theodore Vance said. "And he doesn't know yet." A pause. "His office will be formally notified within the hour," Theodore said. I set the phone down again. I looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at me. Then, slowly, I started laughing. Not the polished, controlled kind, the real kind, surprised out of me, the same way Declan's laugh had been surprised out of him this morning, and Marcus's expression cracked open into something equally delighted and slightly terrified. "River Calloway," he said, pointing at me across the table, "you accidentally gave yourself a seat at the Alpha King's Court." "I cited one clause," I said, still laughing. "One clause. I read for 2 days, and I cited one clause. And now you legally cannot be removed from his presence. By his own territory's law. Because he rejected you. Because he rejected me. We stared at each other. The laughter faded into something quieter and more complicated, and what sat in its place was the particular feeling of a story that had not even come close to being finished. My phone buzzed on the table between us. A new number. But I knew before I read the name attached to it, because I felt the sharp, sudden, unmistakable emotional signature of a man who had just been informed of something he absolutely had not seen coming. The text from Caden Marlowe's personal number read 4 words. "We need to talk." I looked at those 4 words for a long moment. Then I typed back 3. "I know. Tomorrow." And I put my phone face down, picked up my coffee, and looked at Marcus across his cluttered kitchen table. "Well," I said pleasantly. "Well," Marcus agreed. Outside the window, Denver's Tuesday afternoon carried on, golden and indifferent, and entirely unaware that somewhere in a court building across the city, an Alpha King was sitting with the specific, devastating realization that the Omega he had rejected to protect himself had just become the one person in his territory he was legally required to keep close. Sometimes the universe had a very particular sense of humor. I took a sip of my coffee. It tasted like the beginning of something. I stayed at Marcus's until the afternoon light went gold and flat through his kitchen windows, the kind of light that arrives in November like an apology for the cold, brief, and honest, and gone before you fully appreciate it. We talked through everything twice. The bond, the dissolution, the provision, Declan, Senator Price, Caden's text. Marcus made pasta at some point because Marcus processed information by feeding people, and I ate it without fully tasting it because my mind was doing the thing it did when too many variables were moving simultaneously, running quiet calculations underneath every surface thought like a program no one asked to open. By the time I drove home, parked, climbed the stairs to my apartment on the 3rd floor of a building in the Cheeseman Park neighborhood that smelled like old wood and someone's good cooking from the 2nd floor, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, with my dissolution paperwork on the nightstand, and Declan's card and Senator Price's card side by side next to my lamp, I had made exactly one decision. Tomorrow I would go. I would sit across from Caden Marlowe in whatever room he chose for this conversation, and I would listen to what he said, and I would feel what he actually felt underneath what he said, and I would make my decisions from there. Not from anger, not from the morning's adrenaline, not from the complicated warmth Declan's texts had settled in my chest, or the political geometry Senator Price had introduced, or the grief I had accidentally carried home from the court building, steps like a stray that followed me to my car. From information, from clarity, from the particular kind of strength that came from knowing exactly who you were before you walked into a room with someone who had already decided you weren't enough. I set my alarm. I went to sleep. And in the morning I wore the good jacket. The Colorado Alpha Court's administrative offices occupied the top 2 floors of a glass and stone building in downtown Denver that managed to look simultaneously modern and ancient, the way certain powerful institutions did when they had enough money to make their architecture argue with itself. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dark wood paneling, the kind of lobby that made you feel like your footsteps were being evaluated. I signed in at the front desk, took my visitor badge from a receptionist who recognized my name immediately and carefully did not react to recognizing it, and followed a young beta aide named Patrick up to the 14th floor. Patrick was nervous. I felt it coming off him in small, contained waves, the entire elevator ride up. Not afraid of me specifically. More the ambient anxiety of someone who had been given a task adjacent to something significant and was determined not to be the variable that went wrong. "Mr. Marlowe is in the East Conference Room," Patrick said, as the elevator opened. "He asked that I let you know he's alone. No advisors, no staff present." I noted that. "Thank you, Patrick," I said. He nodded, pointed me down the hall, and retreated to the elevator with the energy of someone who had successfully diffused something and was going to go sit quietly for a few minutes. The East Conference Room had a glass wall facing the hallway and a solid wall facing the city, and through the glass I could see Caden before he saw me. He was standing at the window, with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him, looking out at Denver's mid-morning skyline. No jacket, dress shirt, dark gray, sleeves pushed to the forearms in the way that meant he had been here long enough to stop performing formality. I felt his emotional field from the hallway. Controlled. Tightly so. The kind of control that took active maintenance, like holding a door shut against wind. Underneath it, the grief was still there, and something new sitting alongside it that I identified after a moment as resolve. The specific emotional texture of a person who had decided to say something true and was bracing for what came after. I pushed the door open. He turned. For a moment, neither of us said anything. In the morning light, without the charged atmosphere of the courtroom or the cold exposure of the building steps, Caden Marlowe looked like what he actually was underneath the title. A man in his early 30s who was tired in the particular way that came not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy for too long without putting it down. "River," he said. "Not Mr. Calloway. River." I let it land without comment. "Your Majesty," I said, and crossed the room to the conference table and sat down because I was not going to have this conversation standing up like two people who might need to leave quickly. He sat across from me, not at the head of the table, directly across, eye level. That was intentional. I felt the intention in it. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You owe me more than that," I said pleasantly. "But an explanation is a reasonable place to start." Something moved across his expression. Not quite a smile. The shadow of one. Maybe. Brief and complicated. "Everett?" he said. "I know about Everett," I said quietly. He went still. "Marcus Bennett," I said. "He's thorough. And he cares about me, so he researches things." I held Caden's gaze steadily. "I know about the forced bond. I know what you found. I know about the promise you made afterward." The control he was maintaining flickered. Just once. A single crack in the surface, fast and honest. Grief moving through it like light, through a break in cloud cover. "Then you understand," he said. "I understand the why," I said. "That's not the same as understanding why you didn't tell me. In the courtroom, before the formal proceeding, any time in the 4 days between the summit and the acknowledgement, I kept my voice even, not cold, just clear. I would have understood, Caden. If you had told me about Everett, I would have understood. The first time I had used his name, I felt him register it." "I know," he said. The words came out rougher than anything he had said yet, less constructed. "I know you would have. That's not why I didn't tell you." I waited. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at me. "When the bond recognized," he said slowly, "in that room at the summit, I felt it the same way you did. And the first thing I felt, before anything else, was..." He stopped. Started again. "Relief." I had not expected that word. "Relief," I repeated, like something I had been holding finally had somewhere to go. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were direct, making the choice to stay in the sentence rather than retreat from it. And then I felt the relief, and I thought about Everett and what relief had done to him. How the bond had felt like relief to him at the start, too. And he pressed his hand flat against the table. That same gesture, from the building steps. I made the decision before I thought it through. I chose the promise over the person. And that was wrong. The room was very quiet. I sat with what he had said, and felt the truth of it moving through my own chest. Not the part about Everett that I had already processed. The relief part. The thing he had felt first, before the walls went up. Because here was what I had not told Marcus last night. Here was the thing I had filed away under information I wasn't ready to examine. When the bond had recognized at the summit, and my ability had gone completely silent for the first time in my living memory. The first thing I had felt in the silence, before the bond snapped into place, before the surprise and the inconvenience and the dark comedy of standing there with a shrimp cocktail, was the same word. Relief. Like static I had been living inside for so long I had stopped hearing it, had suddenly, completely stopped. I had not told anyone that. I did not tell him now. But I sat across from Caden Marlowe in the 14th floor conference room, with the Denver skyline behind him and the morning light between us, and I felt, in real time, the specific weight of two people sitting across from each other with the same secret, neither of them saying it, both of them knowing the other one knew. The provision, I said, because I needed to move us somewhere practical before I said something I wasn't ready to say. You know about the provision. Theodore called my office yesterday, he said. Yes. I didn't know about it when I filed, I said. I want that on record between us. I wasn't strategizing. I know. And he did know. I felt the certainty of it. River, I'm not here to challenge the provision. I'm not here to ask you to waive it or find a workaround or make this easier for me politically. He met my eyes. I'm here because I want to ask you something, and I need you to know it comes with no pressure and no expectation attached. I raised an eyebrow. Ask. He held my gaze. Stay, he said. Not because the law says you can. Not as a political voice or a protected class member or a clause in a code document. The control in his voice had not broken, but it had softened at the edges, worn down to something more honest underneath. Stay, because I would like the chance to do this differently than I did it yesterday. I'd like the chance to be someone who deserved to be in the same room as you before the bond decided we should be. The Denver skyline sat behind him, indifferent and gray and real. I looked at Kate and Marlowe for a long moment. Then I reached across the table and I did something I had not done since the summit, since the moment of static and silence and the word relief arriving before anything else. I touched his hand, just my fingers against his. Light, deliberate. The contact opened up his emotional field to me at full volume, and what I felt was so layered and so honest and so entirely undefended that I had to breathe through it slowly. Grief, yes. Guilt, yes. The resolve I had felt from the hallway, and underneath all of it, running through everything else like a current through water, that same relief, present and real, and not going anywhere. I pulled my hand back. I'm not forgiving you, I said quietly. Not yet. Forgiveness has a process, and we're at the beginning of it. I know, he said. I'm also, I continued, going to respond to Declan Ashford's invitation, because I make my own decisions, and a good faith invitation deserves a good faith response, and that is not about you. His jaw tightened slightly. I felt the spike of something hot and involuntary move through him, that same something from the building steps that I still didn't have a clean name for. Okay, he said. The word cost him something. I felt it cost him. Okay, I said. I stood. He stood. We were on the same side of something now, I thought. Not the same position. Not even close. But the same side of honesty, which was further than we had been 24 hours ago, and further than I had expected to get this morning. River, he said, as I reached the door. I looked back. He was standing at the conference table with the skyline behind him and his hands at his sides and his expression wearing something I recognized now, something I had a name for. The beginning of wanting to be better than you have been. Thank you for coming, he said. I held his gaze for one breath. Don't make me regret it, I said. And I walked out into the hallway, past Patrick's empty desk, into the elevator, and I pressed the lobby button and stood in the mirrored silence of the descending car and felt my own chest carefully, the way I rarely did, the way I usually avoided. The static was still quiet. It had been quiet since the summit. I was beginning to think it wasn't coming back. The elevator doors opened into the lobby, and I walked out into Denver's mid-morning like a person who had their life together, which was a performance I was committed to maintaining until I reached my car. I made it exactly 11 steps before my phone buzzed. Still thinking about Hartford? I stood on the sidewalk outside the court building, collar turned up against the November cold, and looked at that message for a long moment. The warmth was still there, even through a screen, even without physical contact to amplify it. Declan Ashford had a quality that registered clearly, genuine, patient, the kind of interest that did not tap its foot while waiting for an answer. I typed, "I'll be there," sent it before the version of me that overanalyzed everything could weigh in. His response was immediate. "Good. I'll send the details tonight." I put my phone in my pocket and stood on the sidewalk, and breathed cold Denver air and told myself the decision was practical. Hartford was good territory. Declan was good company. I was an unbonded, autonomous Omega, with a protected court seat and 2 business cards, and absolutely no reason to stay in Colorado for anyone other than myself. All of that was true. I walked to my car and drove home and spent the rest of the day not thinking about the way Caden had pressed his hand flat against the conference table, rigid with the effort of holding himself together, while saying the word relief out loud for probably the first time since Everett died. I was extremely successful at not thinking about it. Hartford, in late November, was colder than Denver and prettier about it, the kind of cold that came with bare trees and stone architecture, and the specific New England quality of a city that had been standing long enough to be comfortable with its own weight. Declan met me at the airport himself. No aide. No formal escort. Just him in a dark coat, standing outside arrivals with his hands in his pockets, and that unhurried quality he carried everywhere, like time worked slightly differently around him, and he had made his peace with it. "You came," he said. "I said I would," I said. He smiled. "The real kind. I know. I just appreciate that saying and doing are the same thing with you." The Ashford Pack gathering was elegant and warm, and full of people who treated Omega guests with the casual, unremarkable respect that indicated it was simply the culture here, rather than a performance for visitors. I noticed it immediately, the absence of a certain kind of tension I had learned to carry in Colorado spaces without realizing how heavy it had gotten. Declan stayed close without hovering, introduced me to people worth knowing, laughed at the right moments, listened at the right moments. By the second evening, I understood why my ability had registered him as genuine from the first handshake. He was, straightforwardly, uncomplicatedly genuine, the kind of person who had been through enough to decide that honesty was simply more efficient than its alternative. We were standing on the terrace after dinner, the city laid out below us in cold, glittering dark, when he turned to face me with the particular quality of someone who had decided to say the thing they had been thinking. "I like you, River," he said. Simply, directly. "I want to be clear about that, so there's no confusion about my intentions." I looked at him. "I know," I said, "because I did. I had known since Hartford. And I think," he continued carefully, "that you like me too. In a real way, not a polite way." "Also true," I said. "But," I looked at him for a moment. "You felt that." "I didn't need to feel anything," he said gently. "I just paid attention." He leaned against the terrace railing, easy and unhurried. "You went quiet every time Denver came up. Not sad. Just," he tilted his head, "unfinished." The city below us was beautiful and cold and entirely unfamiliar. And standing in it, I became aware of something I had been successfully not examining for 4 days. I missed the static being quiet in a specific way, not the absence of noise, the presence of something underneath the quiet. Something that had started at a summit in Colorado with a bond recognition I hadn't asked for and had been living in the back of my awareness ever since, like a frequency I had stopped trying to tune out. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Declan said. "Yes." "The dissolved bond." He held my gaze steadily. "Do you actually feel dissolved?" The terrace was very quiet. Below us, Hartford carried on, indifferent and glittering. "No," I said. The word came out smaller than I intended. True, in a way that surprised me, by arriving without resistance. "No, I don't." Declan nodded slowly, like this confirmed something he had already made his peace with. "Then you should go back," he said. I stared at him. "Declan. River." His voice was warm and completely without bitterness, which was somehow harder to receive than bitterness would have been. "I told you. On the first day. No agenda attached. That includes this." He straightened, hands back in his pockets, the city behind him. "Go back. Say the thing you haven't said yet. See what it costs and whether it's worth it." A pause. "And if it turns out it's not, you still have my card." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I crossed the terrace and hugged him, which surprised us both, his arms coming up after a beat to hold it properly. Warm and steady. The emotional signature genuine all the way through. No performance, no wound. Just a good person letting something go cleanly. You're annoyingly decent, I told him. I know, he said. It's my burden and my gift. I laughed into his shoulder. Then I stepped back, straightened my jacket, and went inside to book an earlier flight. I landed in Denver at 11:47 at night and drove directly to the court building because Caden had texted 3 hours ago saying he was working late, and I did not give myself time to think about what I was doing because thinking had gotten me 4 days of Hartford and an unfinished feeling I was done carrying alone. The building's night security knew my name. Protected class member. Irremovable presence. Gerald's stamp living its best life. I took the elevator to the 14th floor. The East Conference Room light was on. Caden was at the table with his jacket over the chair and his sleeves pushed up and a folder open in front of him that he was clearly not reading because he looked up the moment I pushed the door open like he had been listening for footsteps for longer than the last 30 seconds. We looked at each other across the conference room. "You're back," he said. "I'm back," I said. I crossed the room and stopped at the edge of the table and looked at him. Really looked, with my ability open and honest and not filtering anything, and what I found in Caden Marlowe's emotional field at 11:47 on a November night was so unguarded it almost hurt to receive. Hope, fragile and real and terrified of itself. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to just listen until I'm finished." He nodded, set his pen down. "At the summit," I said, "when the bond recognized, my ability went silent. I told you that, or implied it. What I didn't tell you is what I felt in the silence before the bond snapped into place." I held his gaze. The first thing I felt was relief. Like static, I had been living inside my entire life just stopped. I paused. I have never felt that before. With anyone. I didn't tell you because I was angry, and because knowing it made everything harder, and I was not ready to hand you something true when you had just handed me a public rejection. Caden was very still. "But I'm telling you now," I said, "because I went to Hartford, and Declan Ashford is a genuinely good man, and I still spent 4 days feeling unfinished, and I'm done pretending the quiet is nothing." The room held its breath. Then Caden stood up. He came around the table slowly, not rushing it, giving me every opportunity to step back. And I didn't step back. And when he stopped in front of me, the distance between us was small enough that I could feel the warmth of him without touching, and my ability was reading his emotional field so clearly it was almost loud. Not hope anymore. Certainty. The specific, devastating certainty of a man who has been holding a door shut for a very long time and has finally, completely, let go of the handle. He raised both hands and held my face the way you hold something you thought you had lost, careful and present and entirely done, pretending it didn't matter. His forehead came down against mine. We stood like that, breathing the same cold air, the city outside the window carrying on without us, and my ability, for the second time in my life, went completely silent. Not empty. Full. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, against my forehead. The words came from somewhere below his composure, honest and specific, and clearly costing him something real. Not the courtroom version, not the managed version. "I am sorry, River, for choosing the promise over the person, for not trusting you with the truth, for making you dissolve something that neither of us actually wanted dissolved." I closed my eyes. "I know," I said. "I'd like to do this differently," he said. "All of it. From the beginning. Whatever that looks like, at the pace you need it to move." I pulled back just enough to look at him. His gray eyes were closer than they had ever been, and completely undefended, and I thought about the throne room 4 days ago, the cedar and cold stone, the fury I had felt radiating off him before anyone spoke, and how I had stood in the center of it, and smiled because I had already decided he didn't get to make me small. He hadn't made me small. Neither of us had made the other small. We had just been two people carrying the same relief, and too much pride to say it first. "Don't reject me again," I said quietly. Not a plea, a condition. "Never," he said. The word landed with the weight of a promise, made by someone who understood exactly what promises cost. I looked at him for one more breath. Then I closed the distance. The kiss was not dramatic. It was not the kind that happened in crowded rooms with witnesses and orchestral timing. It was quiet and honest, and tasted like the end of something that had been pretending to be nothing. His hands still holding my face, and mine finding the front of his shirt, and the silence my ability was wrapped in was the fullest, most complete thing I had ever felt in my life. When we pulled back, the Denver skyline sat in the window behind him, dark and gold and indifferent, exactly as it always had been. I rested my forehead against his shoulder. "We have a lot of work to do," I said. "I know," he said. "Forgiveness is a process." "I know. And I'm still keeping my seat at your court." His chest moved under my forehead. A laugh. Small and real. I would expect nothing less. I stood in the 14th floor conference room of the Colorado Alpha Court, in the territory of the man who had rejected me 4 days ago in front of 43 witnesses, with the dissolution paperwork still on my nightstand at home, and Declan's card still in my jacket pocket, and Gerald's stamp living permanently on the public record. And the static was quiet. It had been quiet since the summit. I was beginning to think it was never going to be anything else. That, I decided, was the best thing I had ever accidentally discovered. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, you'll definitely love the next one. It's even crazier and more intriguing than you can imagine. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned. The next story drops soon.